Some events change the course of history. This was one of them. The Battle of Trafalgar, 1805, shattered Napoleon's naval power, ensuring British dominance at sea for a century. By crushing the Franco-Spanish fleet, Vice-Admiral Horatio Nelson not only saved Britain from invasion, but also secured the Royal Navy's control of global trade and warfare. Napoleon would rule Europe, but never the oceans. This is the story. Dawn, October 21, 1805, aboard HMS Victory, off Cape Trafalgar. The first light of dawn broke across the Atlantic, turning the dark waters to rippling gold. A brisk wind filled the canvas of HMS Victory, flagship of Vice-Admiral Horatio Nelson, as it cut through the waves, its hull creaking under the weight of 100 guns. The British fleet sailed southward, 27 ships in all, their bowsprits slicing toward destiny. On the quarterdeck, Nelson stood motionless, his single arm folded behind his back, his gaze fixed on the horizon. His uniform, dark blue with gold epaulettes, was immaculate, but his face bore the deep lines of years at sea. He breathed in the salt air, knowing this would be his last battle. Beside him, Captain Thomas Hardy, Victory's seasoned commander, shifted his stance, his eyes narrowing as he studied the Franco-Spanish fleet in the distance. 33 enemy ships, spread in an imperfect crescent. Villeneuve had the numbers, but Nelson had the discipline. "They outmatch us, sir," Hardy murmured. Nelson's lips curled into the faintest smile. "They outnumber us, Captain. That is not the same thing." The British ships had been sailing for hours, the wind at their backs. The French and Spanish anchored near Cape Trafalgar had been slow to react, their crews unready. Now, as the sun climbed higher, their great ships of the line lumbered into motion. From the main deck the voices of officers and sailors rose in a steady hum. Powder boys, no older than 12, ran back and forth between the gun crews checking cartridges. The boatswain's mates barked orders as Marines in red coats lined the rails, muskets primed. The ship smelled of tar, sweat, and the metallic bite of loaded cannon. A shout rose from the masthead. "Signal from the flagship!" All eyes turned skyward as a row of flags rippled from Victory's halyards. The wind caught the canvas, unfurling the words that would become legend. "England expects that every man will do his duty." A ripple of energy surged through the British fleet. Sailors cheered, their fear momentarily forgotten. On every ship from Collingwood's Royal Sovereign to the smaller Euryalus, the meaning was clear. This was a battle not just for victory, but for Britain's survival. Nelson turned to Hardy, his voice firm. "Let the men eat. We shall engage at noon." Aboard Bucentaure, the French flagship, Admiral Pierre-Charles Villeneuve stood at the rail of his flagship, the Bucentaure, his expression grim. He had spent the morning issuing frantic orders, urging his captains to form a proper line, but the fleet was sluggish. Many of his men were poorly trained, pressed into service too quickly. His captains, uncertain of Napoleon's favor, hesitated to act decisively. Now, the British fleet was closing in, their two columns cutting through the waves like blades. At his side, Spanish Admiral Federico Gravina, a broad-shouldered man with a thick black beard, studied the enemy with dark, wary eyes. "He means to break our line," he said. "A reckless strategy," Villeneuve exhaled sharply. "Reckless, yes, but it is Nelson." They both knew the truth. Nelson never fought by the book. He sought decisive victories, not cautious engagements. And today, he would either triumph or die. Behind them, Captain Jean-Jacques Etienne Lucas of the French ship Redoutable tightened the strap of his cutlass. His ship lay close to Bucentaure, prepared for the brutal close-quarters combat he knew was coming. He had drilled his men relentlessly for this moment, training them to fire muskets and board enemy vessels. If the British came too close, they would pay dearly. Villeneuve raised his spyglass again. The British columns were nearly upon them. The moment of decision had arrived. Aboard HMS Victory, the final approach. The midday sun burned high as Victory plunged into the heart of the enemy line. The great ship moved deliberately, its sails taut, its massive frame steady even as French cannonades erupted ahead. Hardy clenched his jaw as the first enemy salvo fell short, splashing harmlessly into the waves. "They fire too soon," Nelson observed, unfazed. "A sign of nerves." The next barrage struck home. A cannonball smashed through the Victory's main deck, sending wooden splinters slicing through the air. A gunner screamed as the debris tore into his arm, but another sailor pulled him aside, and the crew carried on. Nelson never flinched. He simply turned to Hardy, his voice as calm as if they were dining. "Take us straight in. The Victory's prow cut into the gap between Bucentaure and Redoutable, heading directly for the center of the Franco-Spanish formation. To their right, Collingwood's Royal Sovereign was already deep in the fight, raking the Spanish flagship Santa Ana with a devastating broadside. Hardy gave the order. Fire! The first broadside erupted from Victory's gun deck, the thunderous roar shaking the ship to its bones. A wall of iron shot smashed into Bucentaure, tearing through wood, rigging and flesh. Smoke billowed across the water, the acrid stench filling the men's lungs. Above, the masts creaked under the strain of battle, flags whipping violently in the wind. And so began the Battle of Trafalgar. Noon, October 21, 1805, the battle begins. The world became thunder and fire. From the deck of HMS Victory, Nelson watched his men unleash another devastating broadside into the heart of the Franco-Spanish line. The recoil sent shudders through the ship's massive frame, gun crews scrambling to reload, their bare chests slick with sweat and powder residue. The air hung thick with acrid smoke, stinging the eyes, choking the lungs. To their starboard side, the French flagship Bucentaure reeled under the assault, its hull shattered, its gun decks turned into charnel houses. Admiral Villeneuve, still clutching his spyglass, staggered as a cannonball tore into the stern, splintering wood mere feet from where he stood. "They are cutting us to pieces," his captain gasped. Villeneuve knew it was true. The British had pierced the line, just as Nelson had planned. Now the Franco-Spanish fleet was fragmented, their ships unable to maneuver, firing in confusion as the British hammered them from all sides. But not all of Villeneuve's captains faltered. From the Redoutable, Captain Jean-Jacques Etienne Lucas saw his moment. With the Victory now within boarding range, he roared to his men. "Grappling hooks, board them!" A deadly volley of French musket fire rained down from Redoutable's mizentop. British sailors screamed and fell as sharpshooters picked them off one by one. On the Victory's quarterdeck, Nelson stood exposed, his blue and gold uniform unmistakable. Captain Lucas had told his men, "Kill the Admiral." A French Marine raised his musket, took careful aim and pulled the trigger. Nelson falls. Nelson felt a sharp blow in his left shoulder, as if a hammer had struck him. He staggered but did not fall, not at first. Pain flared in his chest, spreading like fire through his ribs. He tried to speak but only tasted blood. Hardy was at his side in an instant, catching his arm. "My lord, you are wounded." Nelson looked into his captain's eyes. He knew. The ball had struck his spine. "Take me below," he murmured. Two sailors rushed forward, lifting the Admiral carefully, cradling him like a broken doll. Blood darkened his uniform as they carried him down to the dim lantern-lit depths of the Victory's cockpit, where the ship's surgeon awaited. Around them the battle raged on. Collingwood's charge. On the Royal Sovereign, Vice-Admiral Cuthbert Collingwood had no time to mourn his friend. He was deep in the fight, his ship locked in a brutal duel with the Spanish flagship Santa Ana. Collingwood, a gruff but brilliant officer, stood on his quarterdeck, barking orders between cannon blasts. "Keep up the fire. Don't let them reform." His gunners obeyed. Royal Sovereign's broadsides slammed into Santa Ana, mast timbers cracking like gunshots. Admiral Gravina, the Spanish commander, tried to rally his men, but another broadside sent a splinter the size of a dagger deep into his back. Gravina collapsed, mortally wounded. With their leader down, the Spanish fleet faltered. One by one their ships struck their colors, surrendering to the relentless British assault. Villeneuve, aboard the crippled Bucentaure, saw the inevitable. His men begged him to flee to escape capture, but he shook his head. "I will not leave my ship." At 2 p.m. Bucentaure surrendered. By 4 p.m. the battle was over. Nelson's final moments. In the darkened cockpit of Victory, Nelson lay on a bloodied cot, struggling to breathe. Around him, the ship's surgeon worked desperately, but there was nothing to be done. The musket ball had lodged in his spine. Hardy knelt beside him, eyes red. "My lord, we have won." Nelson's lips moved, barely a whisper. "How many ships?" 20 have surrendered." The faintest smile touched Nelson's lips. His vision blurred, but he forced the words out. "Thank God I have done my duty." A final breath, then stillness. Nelson was gone. Above deck, the Union Jack still flew, tattered but proud. The Royal Navy had destroyed the Franco-Spanish fleet. Napoleon's dreams of invading Britain lay at the bottom of the sea. As the sun set over Trafalgar, Britain's greatest admiral was dead, but his victory would echo for centuries. Epilogue. The aftermath. Villeneuve was captured and taken to Britain. Napoleon blamed him for the disaster, and when he was released, he was found dead under suspicious circumstances. Gravina died of his wounds days later. Collingwood took command of the British fleet and continued Nelson's legacy. The Royal Navy ruled the seas for the next century, ensuring Britain's dominance over the world. Trafalgar was more than just a battle. It was the death of Napoleon's naval power and the rise of British supremacy on the oceans. And at its heart was a man who knew he would not live to see victory, but fought for it anyway. Vice-Admiral Horatio Nelson, hero of Trafalgar.
Thank you for listening. If you like these stories, please like, subscribe, comment, and hit the bell.